Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's webinar. This is the final webinar for 2023 in the Productivity and Profitability webinar series being brought to you by Meat and Livestock Australia and Agrista. This series is designed to assist sheep, cattle and goat producers to increase the productivity and profitability of their businesses. This series will provide you with timely technical information relevant to producers across Australia. My name is Tanisha Shields and I am a consultant with Agrista and I will be your host for tonight's webinar. In this webinar, we will be hearing from John Francis from Agrista about assessing and managing business risk. Before I hand over to John tonight, I would like to cover off on some housekeeping topics. So tonight's webinar is being recorded and you will receive a copy of the recording following this webinar. It will also be available on the Agrista and MLA websites. We invite you to ask questions of John throughout the webinar. We will address all of these questions at the end of the webinar. To ask a question, please go to slido.com and enter the code #DEC to ask your questions. I will now hand over to tonight's speaker, John Francis. John is a business management professional with over 15 years experience in agricultural business management consultancy and as well experience in production agriculture and agronomy. John is a competent small business owner and manager. John has a proven understanding of the drivers of productivity and profitability in broadacre agriculture. John assists his clients to develop and implement strategies that improve operational performance and deliver increased financial returns. Okay, John, over to you.
Thanks very much, Tanisha. Yeah, it's nice to be here with you as the host. I am trying, and the technology hopefully will go with me. Hopefully it's there. Yes. And I'm just... I'll just work out the technology my end. It'd seem that I'm relatively incompetent at this process, and that's probably because I've got support from people like you that run me through this process. So, look, thanks very much for the opportunity. Yeah, tonight I'm really excited to be here. I think it'll be a great opportunity. And what the topic I've been tasked with is assessing and managing business risk. But before I jump into business risk, I always like to start my presentations with a bit of a story. And usually these stories involve my family, and this one's no different. So what you see on the slide there in front of you is a bit of a maze. And the reason I put this up is that I've got a teenage son amongst other kids, and I was looking to give him guidance towards his career. And one of the things that I've found really useful in my career is science, and locking onto science has given me a whole wealth of sort of career opportunities. So I went onto the internet and I found this guy called Mark Rober. Now, Mark Rober's an ex-NASA scientist. I think he's got expertise in engineering and physics and all sorts of, wonderful science and gadgetry. And he's moved out of that to use his scientific knowledge and his engineering skills to become a YouTuber. And the way he's using those skills is to design certain activities. And this is one of them. So the problem Mark Rober had is that he had squirrels in the backyard that were eating birdseed. And you may think, why the hell are you talking about squirrels in the backyard of an American? But there is a point to this story. So rather than taking the conventional approach to fixing the squirrel problem, and you do with that what you will, but he designed a sort of squirrel Olympics, if you like. And he figured that if the squirrels were good enough to get to the nuts and seeds that they were previously eating and taking from the birds, then he figured that they were entitled to those seeds and nuts. So he set up this sort of obstacle course, And he used all his scientific knowledge to work out how far off the ground it'd need to be so that the squirrels couldn't eat, couldn't just jump through. They actually had to navigate the course. And then finally, if they did actually navigate the course, they got to this thing, which you can see in the foreground, which is that red hashed piece. Now, that's got this actuator on it, and it's got a featherweight touch, so that if they actually did make it to that, they're then hurled through the air and still don't get to the nuts. Now, this is hours of fun for everyone, and I'll give you an idea. So the backwards hat-wearing guy there is Mark Rober. There's a squirrel that hit the, he got through the maze but didn't quite get there, so it's getting hurled through the air. And don't worry, for those of you who are worried about animal welfare, and we all should be, of course, no squirrels were harmed in this exercise because he's got a net out the back. Now, I thought this was so good, and there's more squirrels flying through the air for fun. So you could watch this stuff for hours, of course. But I thought, what a great use of science. I thought, this is great. I'm going to forward this to my son. So I sent a text to my son, note the time, Saturday morning at 8 a.m. Pretty low probability that he's going to look at that. And I said, this is a great use of science, figuring that he might actually be guided towards science in his career. And just to give you an idea of the extent of what we're facing with our youth, here is my son's response. 13 minutes, geez, I'm not made of time. 13 minutes is the length of time that he would have had to watch that video. Now, that would be an acceptable response if my son was, finding a cure for cancer or being benevolent to someone or being philanthropic or that sort of thing. But this kid doesn't do much of that. So the fact that he can't find 13 minutes in his schedule is particularly worrying. And I guess it's sort of the focus that I really wanted you to think about. Are you too busy to fix the problem? Because there's a lot of us saying we're busy on certain things. Hopefully you're a lot more busy than this guy. But, we're not actually, we're putting off addressing the real issue. So that's the context of my presentation. And hopefully I'll be able to give you some tips about what are some solutions, firstly contextualizing the problem, and then giving you some ideas on what I think the solutions may be. So I thought I'd just give you some context about the changes that we're experiencing over time. And I guess one of the changes that we're experienced is this really strong financial performance in the preceding 5 years to now. And I wanted to just give you some context about how different it is now relative to sort of 2 years ago. And I've looked at a business with 15,000 DSEs at 80% equity to give you some idea of just how different things are now relative to then. So I've gone back to 2021, and I'm going to compare 2023, same business, same scale, same equity, just to give you an idea of the difference in the cash position of this business. So if we start with operating profit, and operating profit is basically gross profit, which is sales less purchases and inventory change, less enterprise expenses, less overhead expenses. So all the operating side of the business. In a business of 15,000 DSEs with solid performance, they would have been generating around close to $1 million worth of operating profit in that business. So then if we look at the annual interest costs back then, which I think I've got in this at around 3%, we were sitting at around $121,000 worth of interest. And if we bring that through to cash or profit after interest, which of course is not the last bit of cash that you've got in the business because there's still a lot of demands on this $838,000, then this is the difference between the two. So a lot of cash floating around in 2021. Fast forward to 2023, and I did this for pricing now, not 4 weeks ago, which would have been even worse. We've got the level of operating profit sits at around $390,000. So that's the extent to which the difference in commodity prices has driven basically income lower because I didn't change operating costs at all between these two scenarios. Then if we have a look at the interest costs in this business, they've gone from 121,000 to 283,000. So significantly more pressure in this business. But the issue, of course, is that that only leaves $106,000 worth of profit after interest. And there's all sorts of additional costs beyond the profit after interest stage that this has got to fund, namely repayment of debt, because we've just taken out the interest cost so far, capital expenditure, personal expenses, and so on. So you can see that the difference there is, you know, $730,000 less cash now relative to 2021. So a significant change between years. But now let's have a look at a business that's not so strong. So that's a very strong business. Now let's have a look at one which has got moderate financial performance. So same scenario, 15,000 DSEs at 80% equity. That business in 2021 would have generated around $555,000 worth of operating profit. So the first thing hopefully you'll notice from that is that's roughly half what the best operators are doing. So in the first place, you know, there's a lot of opportunity cost in a business that's not achieving that really good performance. But if we have a look then and deduct the annual interest cost, which is exactly the same scale business and so on, there might be some nuances between those businesses, but $433,000 worth of cash. So again, the cash is lower than the preceding scenario, and the difference between the two is largely in income and maybe a bit of the cost structure as well. But now fast forward to 2023, that same business with moderate performance is generating around $105,000 from 15,000 DSEs. It's got interest costs of $283,500, with the key difference between the green and the white lines there being primarily the difference in interest rate going from 3 to 7%. And out here, of course, if you've only got 105,000 at operating profit and you've got to deduct the interest cost of 283, that means you're heading backwards in terms of cash flow. And the difference between those is not significantly different relative to the preceding case, but of course it's a lot worse because now you're effectively making a loss of $178,000. So that's just a bit of context, I guess, for you know, where we find ourselves at the moment. So hopefully out of that, you can see that there's a compelling case to get better and to really focus on the things that matter. And I'd like to talk about where I think some of those things that matter are. And interestingly, this is at 80% equity. And if you think about that, 2 years ago, 80% equity was a very safe position. But 80% equity now, with commodity prices being where they are, for a lot of businesses is not a particularly safe place to be. And the lower you get in that equity, the harder it is. So with the key issue not necessarily being the equity level, but the cost of the finance in the business relative to the operating profits that are generated by the business. Okay. So I guess what I'd like you to do now is just to take a break. I just want you to, if you can use your phones and this QR code thing on the right, and just pick up your phones. Hopefully you've all got them near you. We can't live without them these days. And you just do the QR code thing of that thing on the right, and hopefully it'll bring you up to a survey. And in this survey, I just want to ask you some questions, because these questions are going to load me up for this presentation a little bit, and hopefully they'll start populating some of the data in this presentation. And as I'm doing this, the technology's failed me, so I'm trying to do two things at once, and knowing that I'm male, but let's see if I can drag myself out of the mire here and get this going. I've just got to put in a password and which is always challenging in itself. But if you can just go to that QR code and answer the questions that are in front of you, that would be great. And I'm trying to multitask. I've made my passwords really complex, and now I've got two-factor authentication, of course, which doesn't help either. And we'll try that. And then I've got to do this, and hopefully the technology might come back with me. We'll see. Now that I've jumped through all those hurdles, hopefully what we will see is a live poll, but we're not seeing that, which is really annoying. So I think in the interests of progress, I might progress through this. But I guess the three or four questions that I had there for you, one of them was, what enterprises do you run? The next one was, what do you know your production level in your business? And the one after that was, do you know your cost of production? And when I say, do you know it, what I'm really asking, and I think I asked, do you record it annually? What I'm really asking is, if you really know it, could you teach someone how to calculate your cost of production and how production is calculated? Because they're very important questions you need to ask yourself. So I think the technology is really letting me down here, Nish. You might have to take over if you can. And can you just go to slide 7 if you can do that, please?
Sure can. Thanks, John. If just try stop share and start share again.
Okay.
And while you're doing that, I'll get this up.
Stop sharing. And I'll try and share again with that one.
If you can click the next slide.
Yeah. Which? Yep, great. Thank you. So we'll leave the, sadly, the poll didn't work, but it will be in the background. So when I've run that poll before, the response is basically has been that around 80% of the people who respond to that either aren't recording their cost of production, aren't recording their production levels, or don't know how to calculate their cost of production. And that's not a criticism, it's just a statement of fact. Tonight, I don't know what that is because I can't get the technology to work with me. But I think the real, if that result is exactly the same tonight, then I'd really encourage you to start there. And that's what I'm going to largely talk about tonight, is really about cost of production. So my challenge to you is, what have you got in your control to take control of this low commodity price environment? And I think you've got two measures. The first is cost of production, and the second one is production. And I'll talk you through what I mean by that. And then there's one means, in my view. The means of getting there is optimizing feed utilisation. So I'm encouraging you to start understanding cost of production and production as metrics in your business. And then I'll walk you through how I see optimizing feed utilisation as a good way of getting you to the end game. Okay, so I think the reason I want to focus on cost of production is because it's something you've got in your control. Whereas if I focus on profitability, it's really price dependent. And I don't want to take the focus off prices at the moment onto something that you do have control over. And I guess if you accept the fact that we're in a commodity market, and if ever there was a year to give us a reminder that we're in a commodity market, this is the one. Basically, commodity prices have done what they do best, and that's been volatile. They shot up at a rate that we just, couldn't fathom, and they shot down with a rate that we just couldn't fathom. So if you told me 5 years ago that, steer prices could have got to $6 or $5.80, I would have laughed at you. And if you told me 2 years ago where they were at $5.80 that they could have got back to $1.80, I would have laughed at you. But that just shows how naive I was and how much I lost touch with the fact that we are a commodity business. And so I guess what you've got in your control is cost of production and production. Now, they are actually intrinsically linked, and I'm going to talk to how they are linked. And I'm going to give you some examples of how setting some targets can assist you in managing your business for these tight times. So and then I'm going to talk you through how optimizing feed utilization is part of that solution. So I just wanted to run through what some targets are in terms of production. And I think the first thing is I'm just going to stick to beef breeding and prime lamb. I'm really talking about a sort of self-replacing system here. And I guess the first thing to note is that production targets are dependent on the resource base. So what I mean by that is I can't give you a production target that is really suited just to your environment. The reason I can't do that is because I don't know anything about your environment. So the production target that you set has to be in line with the type of resources that you have. And I'm just putting up some examples for a medium to high rainfall zone. They're not suited to rangelands or other types of environment or areas where you haven't done some pasture improvement. But I just wanted to run you through an example of what a production target might be. So what we're looking at here is targets for greater than 500 mil, where the majority of your pasture base is improved or got very good soil types and that sort of thing. And so one of those targets for beef I think you can set is 45 kilos per hectare per 100 mils of rainfall. And I'm talking about generating more production than 45 kilos of live weight per hectare for every 100 mils of rainfall. And I'm going to talk you through what that means shortly. And then if you're in a prime lamb situation, I really think you should be targeting above 22 kilos of carcass weight per hectare per 100 mils of rainfall. And I'm going to run you through an example of how we might use that as well. And then if we want some cost of production targets, so they're your production targets, and they actually help you achieve these cost of production targets. And if you want a cost of production target for a beef breeding business, it's under $1.50 a kilo live weight. And in a prime lamb business, it's under $4.50. The absolute best producers at the moment are doing under $4, but I accept that that is becoming more and more challenging at the moment. So I've given a target of $4.50. Now, obviously, if prices are at $1.50 and $1.50 a kilo at live weight, you're earning duck eggs. And if they're at $4.50 a kilo carcass weight, you're earning duck eggs again. But it just gives you some idea of where you can hit the target you can set. If you want to set a target lower, that's fine. I like to think they've got to be achievable. And we've got, between 10 and 20% of the database that are actually hitting these targets and producing beef for under $1.50, and 10 to 20 that are under $4.50. So I'm just going to show you how I would engineer a low cost beef production system. So if we start with that production target of 45 kilos per hectare per 100 mils, and let's say we're in a 630 mil rainfall zone, that's the equivalent of 6.300 millimetre rainfall increments. If we multiply 6.3 by 45, it gives us a production target in kilos of live weight per hectare. Now, if you've got a good production system, and when I mean a good production system, I'm really talking about one that matches feed supply with feed demand, what you'll find is that you'll generate about 21 kilos of beef per DSE. And a dry sheep equivalent is what a DSE is. It just explains the amount. It's just an energy use. So it's about 8.4 megs of metabolizable energy consumed is roughly what it is. And the reason we turn things into dry sheep equivalents is that one of your most limited resources on farm is pasture energy. So economics is a study of scarcity and how you turn that scarcity into productivity or efficiency. And so that's the reason we use DSEs. So it also allows us to be able to compare the energy consumption of different species as well. So in this case, if I divide the 284 kilos per hectare by 21 kilos of DSE, what's it give me? It gives me a target stocking rate. And in this case, that target stocking rate's around 13.5 DSEs. That stocking rate is an output of the target production that we've set ourselves. It's nothing else. Okay, so now if we set ourselves a cost of production target, what have we got? Well, we've got $1.50. Now, if we know our cost of production is $1.50 and we're generating 21 kilos of beef per DSE, what we've now got is an operating cost structure for a beef herd of $31.50. We know that if we want to target 284 kilos of beef per hectare, and we can achieve 21 kilos per DSE, then with a cost structure of $1.50 for every kilo produced, that'll be equivalent to a cost structure of $31.50 per DSE. Now, we can go one step further in that we know from benchmarking data that the overhead cost in a beef system represents about 80% of the total cost, and that's production system related as well. So now we can even break it down into what our overhead cost structure should look like. If we multiply $31.50 by 80%, it's $25 a DSE, and then that leaves us $6.30 to spend on enterprise expenses. And surprise, surprise, that's what some of the best producers are doing at the moment, or slightly under that. So now I want to do the same thing for a prime lamb production business, and the targets are just slightly different, but the process is exactly the same. Okay, so now let's have a look at a low-cost lamb production system. In this case, I've got my target of 1 ewe join per hectare per 100 mils. Now, the industry's fixated on fecundity and weaning percentage. I like to bring it back still to stocking rate, and this is a measure of stocking rate. So if we achieve that 1 ewe joined, and I'll show you how all these production metrics are linked through this. So let's say that's our production target, and we've got 630 mils of rainfall again, 6.3 increments of 100. That gives us 6.3 ewes joined per hectare. Now, in a good production system, the number of DSEs per ewe joined, so that's with around 130 to 40% lambs weaned to ewes joined across flock, that will be around 2.5 DSEs. So now we can multiply our 2.5 DSEs by our 6.3 ewe joined, and that gives me a stocking rate of 15.75. So not monumentally different to our beef example, slightly different. And there are nuances, and these targets aren't exactly perfect, but you can see they're aligning pretty closely. So that's an output of our target of 1 ewe joined per hectare per 100 mils, and the number of DSEs per ewe joined being 2.5. Now, the important part of that 2.5 DSEs per ewe joined is that the lambs are out the gate at that 22 kilos within, around 180 days. If you're hanging around, or your lambs are hanging around, that 2.5 DSEs per ewe joined turns to 3 or more DSEs per ewe joined, and then you've got more cost, and it's harder to maintain a low cost structure. So very important that you understand the linkages between these things. So now let's look at production. Again, your production system, hopefully you can generate around, or the best do around 11 kilos of carcass weight per DSE, which means that production per hectare, 15.75 by 11 kilos per DSE gives me 173 kilos of carcass weight per hectare, which equates to around 27.5. And remember, I set our target at 22. We've exceeded that. And this is roughly half the 45 or whatever it was in the beef example. Why is it half? Because we're talking carcass weight rather than live weight now. So the two align pretty closely, not perfectly, but pretty closely in this example. So let's set our cost of production target for $4.50 in our lamb example. Now, lamb becomes a bit more tricky than beef in so much as there's multiple income streams from a lamb production business. What are they? They're the sheep trading, which is the sale of the ewes. They're the lamb trading, which is the sale of the lambs, and they're the wool trading. So all of those are different income streams, and we need to account for those in cost of production. Now, we know that the sheep trading is probably going to be a loss. Why do we know that? Because we buy in our ewe lambs, even if we're internally transferring them, and typically they're at a higher cost than the ewes we're selling out of the system. So what I've done here is assumed, so our operating cost, if I just step back from cost of production is $4.50. If I multiply that by our, where are we, cost of production by our 11 kilos per DSE, it gives me, and then I've got to take into account the fact that we've got 97% of our income coming from the lamb component of what we do. So that gives me $51 to spend per DSE in our lamb business in much the same way as I had $25 to spend, I think it was, in our beef business. No, it was more than that. It was $31 or $32 we had to spend. This is $51 we get to spend. Why do we need more? Because we shear sheep. So let's have a look at where that goes. $10 of that will be consumed in the sheep trading loss. That's the difference between the price that you get for your cull ewes and the price that you got to pay for your rams and your bringing your young sheep in. So if I deduct that $10 from my operating cost per DSE, it gives me $41 worth of operating costs that I get to spend on enterprise expenses and overhead costs within my sheep business, which is certainly at the pointy end. There's not that many people doing that, but that's where you got to be if you want this cost of production target, if you want to hit that target of $4.50 per DSE. All right, so that's sort of the pathway, I think, to setting some targets. So I've tried to drag you into how to get there. But I just want to explain that getting it half right doesn't pay. So often people take the message and say, right, John, you're telling me I need a low cost of production, so I'm going to generate a low cost of production. I'm going to do that by cutting all my costs. That is not what I'm talking about, and I'll give you an example shortly, but I just want to show you why you need a low cost of production in combination with production. You've got to have both. I listened to a landline thing a couple of years ago, and they were talking about a certain farming system, and this person who was espousing the virtues of their farming system did a great job of putting one over the interviewer, because all they did was talk about cost of production and how low there was, but they didn't talk about their production level. And it's the two that matter, because the margin is dependent on not only the difference between the price received and the cost of production, but also the multiple of kilos that you do it over. So let's have a look at what might happen if you don't get it quite right. So what I've done in this graph, I've got cost of production down the bottom, I'll have production in the middle, and I'll have operating profit per hectare. And it's important that we measure some things per hectare over on the right-hand side. And I'm going to run you through a low cost of production system with high production first, and then I'll run you through a low cost of production system with low production, and we'll just demonstrate the difference. So both of these systems have a low cost of production, and it's a beef example in this case. So $1.50 per kilo of beef produced. But now have a look at this light green line. What you've got is the high production business is generating 284 kilos of beef per hectare, and the low production business is generating 189. Now, I can't remember what price I used, but again, it's a bit irrelevant, because the difference is the magnitude of the difference is what matters. And what you see here is an operating profit of $425 per hectare from the low cost of production, high production system, relative to, a lot less, a third less in that case, from the system that got cost of production right, but didn't get production right. And so it's the combination of the two, not one in isolation, that absolutely matters. A low cost of production plus low production is low profit. It's got to be a low cost of production plus plenty of production. That's what generates you the margin in the business. So the question then is, how do I calculate production? If you're one of the people that doesn't calculate production at the moment, and that's not a criticism of you, I think you've identified an opportunity in your business. So hats off to you. One way you can do it is basically go to the MLA cost of production tool, and I've put the link of that tool right there. And basically what you need to know is your livestock inventory, you need to know your livestock sales and purchases, and you need to have a livestock trading schedule. If you've got those three things, you can start to measure production pretty simply. And that tool is a great way of starting and is readily available, and it's the best price. It's free. That's a price I love to hear. Okay, so if you're going down that path of, okay, I've set my target, but now how do I do it? Well, the next step is then designing a system that actually allows you to deliver on a low cost of production. And this squiggly line is probably the most important thing that you can take into account when you're designing a system to drive a low cost of production in your business. Now, it looks pretty straightforward. It's just a, squiggle over not much feed in January in this case, a bit more in the autumn months, a lot more in the spring months, and then, crashing down in December. Your pasture curve may not look like this because you may be from a different environment relative to the environment that I'd generated this curve from. That's fine. I'm not worried about you being from a different environment. Work out what your curve looks like. I want to talk you through the things that matter in this curve, though. And the first thing I think that matters is that 60% represents 60% of the whole of the feed within that year occurs in a concentrated 3 to 5 month period. That says to me, I want to be really focusing on that area over a lot of other areas as being probably one of the most important in terms of feed availability and feed use. The next thing to think about is where does the variability occur? And I think the thing about autumn systems, and I'm talking about southeastern Australia primarily, this may be less so for those southwestern areas. You work out where the variability is yourself. But in the autumn, we've typically got this really high variability. That is, one year it might be very good and the next it might be very poor. And the frequency of that variability might be high as well, which I'll talk to next. And in that spring period, we tend to have far more moderate variability. So it still can vary a lot, but the frequency with which it varies is, or the deviations tend to be lower. So the frequency and variability is the other thing I like to think of when I'm looking at this curve. And I think about autumns around this part of the world or southeastern Australia, and the frequency is quite moderate. 5 in 10 years, there's going to be a fair degree of variability. And then if I look at that spring period, yes, it's variable and I can get very low feed supply in that time, but it tends to be with low frequency that I get it. And it's the sum of all those things that you weigh up to design your system. So if I'm designing a system for this type of environment, I'm really thinking I need my lactating animals out that spring end, and I need to make sure that my market requirements are met prior to feed quality declining, which is not a feature of this graph. This is just a feed supply graph. It doesn't actually tell me anything about quality, but the fact that it is declining in December probably indicates that quality's gone as well. So where do I find some tools that can help me with that? Again, MLA's got tools. On the left-hand side, if you go to that feed demand calculator, it says under maintenance, but if you dig a little bit further, it will actually find you the tool if you just go to that link. So it says it's under maintenance, but if you keep fishing around, you'll generally find it. And that tool is actually quite practical because it brings up your feed curve for your environment. And if you don't like the feed curve it's brought up, because that feed curve is a weighted average of your whole business, and that feed curve is unique to your business. It's dependent on the amount of improved perennial you've got. It's dependent on the amount of salt bush that you might have. It's dependent on the amount of grassland that you might have. It's dependent on the native, and it's then dependent on the proportion. That's how you get that weighted average curve across your whole farm. But importantly, if you have a look in the top right of that, the tool on the website actually tells you how many kilos of dry matter that you might grow in certain environments as well if you just use the default setting. So a really powerful tool there for you to use. So the next step, now that you know your feed supply, what's the next step? Well, I think the next step is designing a system. Now that you know you've got to consume as much of that feed in the time where it's there, but knowing that that feed's also got to carry you through that January, February period, at least in this sort of business. So if we have a look at this, I design a system for this type of environment where I'm calving here. I'm going to want my time of turn off out here. Why? Because feed quality declines. Why wouldn't I want to calve back in this period, in that autumn period? Well, I think the variability is too great. And I think if you're carrying, you tend not to be able to use this spring period as easily, in my experience. Now, there's any number of nuances on that system, and your right time mightn't be spring because, you know, your whole curve comes back from December and your feed might decline in October. Well, that might mean your appropriate calving date is June, not August. That's fine. You work it out for yourselves. It's very unique to your own area and your own business. What I'm trying to do is give you an example. Okay, and then if I have those animals off for 450 kilos, then I know that I can consume around greater than 50% of my feed, and I know I can hit those production targets that I've set myself. And if I'm looking at a prime lamb business, it's slightly different. I've got to drag my lambing date forward a bit to a period where I don't really want to do it, but I don't have a choice. Why? Because I think I've got to get my sales off by this time. I want them out the gate so that they're not hung over for that period where I don't have a lot of feed quality, because I'll have all my ewe lambs, of course, that are that I've got to carry through. So if we reverse engineer the system, if I lamb back here in this sort of July period and my lambs are dropped at 4 kilos and I've got to get them to 46, then that gives me 42 kilos. Basically, if I divide by 250 grams, it's about 170 days or thereabouts. So I don't think I think it can be very costly carrying a lot of lambs over this autumn period, because there's a high cost of carry, there's low marginal weight gain beyond a point, and you start to compromise on the most important thing, which is used joint per hectare per 100 mils. Happy to be challenged on that later on. So what does a low-cost system look like? Well, we've now gone from feed supply to feed demand. This is actually what a curve looks like. And you'll note about these curves that they're not perfect. They don't perfectly match that peak in spring. Why? Because there's no such thing as a perfect match in agriculture. There's always a compromise. And I think this is one of the best compromises you can get. But I'm happy to always be challenged on that. So if you think there's a better system out there, I'm certainly happy to look at it. We just get our ideas from, you know, the benchmarking data that we collect and the reams of people that give us the data about their systems and so on. Okay, so what are the outputs of high feed utilisation? Well, I think the first one is, so what we've done, if I just step you back through what we've done, we've set some targets around production. We've then set some targets around the cost structure. We've then looked at how can we do that? Well, we need to look at our feed base. And then what we've done is gone, righto, we know our feed base looks like this. Now we've designed our system. Our system is what now gives us this high level of feed utilisation. So now what I'm talking about is what are the outputs of high feed utilisation. So I'm trying to tie it right back to up front, where we're driving a low cost of production with plenty of production, which are the only two levers we've really got to pull in our business. So the first output, I think, of high feed utilisation, people talk about stocking rate. I like to talk about feed utilisation. Stocking rate is a function of feed utilisation. And so if you have high feed utilisation, you generally have a greater stocking intensity relative to a system with low feed utilisation. What's next? Well, the next beautiful thing about high feed utilisation is that you tend to get more production per unit of area. Why is that important? Because I actually can spread my overhead cost structure over more productive units. Why is that important? It drives that low cost of production. So this is no different to a factory wanting to get the factory humming. Our factory is our grass factory. We've just got to make sure that we utilise the grass, and utilising the grass means that we basically have a greater stock intensity, which basically means more production per unit area. The other beauty of this is that if you design that simple system that achieves that some of those objectives that we talked about in terms of systems, you generally get better labour efficiency. Why? Because basically you've got less feeding out of season, and basically you've got more capacity to do more with your time. Simplicity is the other thing that drives improved labour efficiency, as does, of course, investments in the right thing on farm. And finally, the output of high feed utilisation is a lower cost of production. And I've already talked about how that's done. It's done through more production per unit of area, which drives down your overhead cost structure per productive unit, which basically delivers a lower cost of production. So at no point have I talked about cost cutting here. I'm really talking about how I can enhance the business to drive more out of the same. And more is really about more production to drive a lower cost of production. Okay, so what are the attributes for success? Well, I think the first one is you actually need to be a skilled decision maker to actually utilise your feed efficiently. So I think decision making is a skill. I've often talked about, you know, the difference between some of the more profitable producers and the others. I think it is that they're often on the edge with their feed utilisation, and that means they've got to make more iterations of those hard decisions. So what that drives is a better skill in decision making. The next one is understanding the feed base and livestock condition. If you're at optimum or driving feed utilisation above 50%, then you're going to have times where your livestock condition will be lower than desirable at certain times. You've got to manage that interface between the feed base, and you've got to juggle whether you maintain those on the pasture and have suboptimum condition, or whether you maintain that condition or supplementary feed at times. So that is a very fine line that you're walking, and it requires a bit of skill. The next one is knowing the links between your production and your financial performance. And I think that's where a lot of the courses like Business Edge or those sorts of courses are trying to inform you about the marriage between that financial performance of your business and the production aspects. And one of the reasons I love benchmarking groups is because that is actually what we do. We actually assist people in understanding that linkage between the production components of your business and the productivity components and the financial performance. Anyone can tell you about the financial performance, but what the challenge is telling you, taking that financial performance and putting it in the context of your system and really tying it in with your production system and understanding the energy requirements and understanding how that links to all those key performance measures. Okay, the next one is a proactive operational calendar. If you're starting to utilise feed in those upper limits, you're going to need to act proactively rather than reactively, because previously where you might have had thrift in your animals or resilience, you might lose a bit of that resilience. Where you had a week to act in the past, that'll be a day to act now when you go down this path. So that is really challenging, and that's important that you get some of those animal health things in advance rather than, you know, it might be too late. And the next one is that they're very operationally efficient. What I mean by that is, you know, if I'm getting livestock in to handle, there's always a purpose. They're never just, you know, there's never no purpose to getting them in, and I'm trying to do multiple handlings at once or multiple activities at once. And finally, they really, some of these attributes for success in a high productivity or high feed utilisation system are understanding compromise. You know, they're okay with feeling uncomfortable because they know that you've got to feel a little bit uncomfortable at times to actually be at those optimum levels of feed utilisation. And so I guess the next point is high feed utilisation isn't for everyone. You know, some people don't like feeling like that, and I think that's choice. You absolutely have that choice, provided you don't have a level of debt that means you've got no choice. And that's what I want to walk you through next. That's my last slide. I think where we've got to is there's a lot of people who are saying, yeah, I don't really want to push the system. I was happy with it when I was, you know, cruising along. The problem is they've taken on the additional debt. They might have expanded their business, or they've got reasonably high debt loads in their business. No longer can the business afford to have a system that isn't productive or it has that lower level of productivity. So I'm going to run you through a case study of a client that I actually had this case with. I said, I don't really want to push things, but I actually don't think they've got the discretion for that choice. Well, they do. They can give the money back, or they can drive productivity. So the question here is, can you afford production discretion? And I think production discretion is something for those people that don't have a lot of liabilities in their business and that are reasonable equity levels and at the moment. But a lot of people have really, expanded over the last little while, and so they don't have that same level of discretion that they had in the past. And if you think back to that first slide, what I'm saying is, in the past, you could probably get away with it because you had plenty of cash. Now we've got a lot less cash. We've got to look at other ways of actually meeting the funding requirements of the business. So in this business, there's about 470 cows or thereabouts plus followers. The equity level was 75% and had an asset value of around $15 million. The profit after interest in this business was minus 200 grand. Production levels were around 187 kilos of live weight per hectare, and this is in a reasonable rainfall area, probably growing about over 8 tonnes of feed per hectare in rainfall up above 750 mils, I think, from memory. And the cost of production in that business was $2.21. So I just want to talk you through one way of dealing with this. So one way of dealing with that is to obviously reduce your equity level, give the money back and liquidate some assets. The other way is to drive more productivity out of the business. So in this case, we got to 721 cows plus followers, which the business had capability for. It did drop the equity to 73%. Why? Because we had to borrow to buy the extra cows and followers. But the beauty of this was we drove 288 kilos out of the business. We put on, I think, a bit more of a labour unit. So we didn't maintain the same cost structure. So we actually increased cost to do it. But we drove our cost of production down to $1.50. And what we achieved was $18,000. Now, you might say, well, that's not exactly a wonderful return, and I would completely agree with you. But if you think the commodity prices are going to change, and I don't think necessarily hope is a great strategy, but a 15% increase in price from a low pricing base, which is where we've come from, which we might already have achieved, incidentally, over that last little bit of when the ECI's headed up, takes our profit after interest on the left-hand side with the low production system to minus 110. Now, but look where we get to. With a lot more production in the system, we get to $155,000. So I guess the point is, I'm not sitting there thinking we're living in hope for a 15% price change, but what I am saying is this business has two choices. One is to liquidate assets, and the other is to become more productive. Becoming more productive gives a short-term gain, and sure, it doesn't fix the problem straight away, but if there is a very slight correction by 15%, then we move from a loss of 199,000 or a loss of 110,000 to 155,000 worth of a profit here. So again, I've spent more money in this business. I've taken on more liabilities, but now you can see I've got 155 grand. I've got the capacity to repay those liabilities. Whereas if I remained where I was, I don't have that capacity. Okay, I'm summing up now. So I just want to give you some steps to get back on track here. I think the first one is, I think you can engineer your production system and your cost targets. I think you've just got to start. If you haven't started your journey on, and you're not already recording your production levels, use some of those tools to understand your production levels in your business. start there. The next step is then engineering. Go back through this video and work out how I actually calculated some of those things. They're all pretty straightforward. Now, that's probably like saying, you know, well, I'll show you straightforward, John, come and knock the wool off my 6,000 ewes. And obviously I can't do that. I've got no capability of that. And you might argue that that's straightforward. I guess the point I'm making is start your journey. If I wanted to start my journey about becoming a shearer, you know, I'd knock the wool off a few. I'd try and work out how I should be standing. I'd try and do some research. I'm encouraging you to start doing some research. Take the first step. So you can engineer your production system and your production and cost targets. The next step is look at that feed curve. Look at what it looks like for your business, and it may look nothing like the one I presented because you're in a completely different area. That's fine. Work out what yours looks like. The next step is then design your system around the things I've just mentioned there that drive that production out of your business. Then you can conduct this partial budget, which is exactly what I did there. We had to buy another 250 cows, which cost us whatever it was. I can't exactly remember. I think I spent $2,000 in that analysis, which was $500,000. We earned 155 when the price corrected. So that's a break even in 3.5 years or thereabouts. That's a partial budget. That's what you've got to do. Then assess the additional capital requirements, your view of the perceived risk, and your view of the skills required. And finally, calculate your production and your cost of production annually. Those things come at no cost. And then what that does is takes your focus off profit, because I've had clients in the last few years who are watching that profit line, and over 5 years they watched profit go up, but the only thing that dragged it up was price. Their production was actually declining. So they weren't watching the right metric. And that's where I want you to focus. Focus on that production metrics and that cost of production metric. So, Tanisha, I think I'll leave it there. Hopefully I'm still on. I will stop sharing and hand back to you.
Thank you, John. That was great. We definitely covered a lot of ground in a very short time, so everyone will be able to go back through the recording to see that again. There are a couple of questions come through, but if you do have questions in the audience, just head to slido.com and enter the code #DEC, and that way we'll be able to answer any additional questions you have. The first question that I've had come through, John, is how do I make sure that the increase in production is not at too great of an increase in cost?
Yes. Okay, thanks. Well, that's that partial budget part, which is not easy, I acknowledge. But this is where, and so what is a partial budget is the question. Well, in that cow example, if I can use that, that cow example, basically, can you just bring that up, please, Nish, or is that too challenging for you? If you could bring that up, I'll just use that as an example to help answer that question, because I think it goes a long way to sort of answering that. So keep going down. It was right down the bottom. It was the second last slide, hopefully. Yep, that one. Right. So in this example, really, and if you just go back, if you can, you might have to put it on full screen if you can, Nish, because that will help me. I don't know whether I'm really chucking everything your way at the moment, aren't I? I've put you on the spot. Look, it doesn't matter too much, but basically I can't, there was 720 cows versus 469, I think, was my recollection. In fact, I can do it here. 721 versus 469 was the number of cows. Now, what that tells me is I've got to go out there and buy the additional cows plus followers. So I need the capital to firstly purchase those cows. Then I need the capital to run those cows, which if we think about where we were previously, that was around $6 a DSE or thereabouts. But the beauty of running these additional cows, particularly in this business, was I only needed a little bit of extra labour to get me, thank you, that's it, perfect. So I'm running an extra, whatever it is, cows. What's the difference between 470 and 720? What's that, 250 odd? I'm running another 250 cows in this business. I get the progeny is the value of the additional income here. Basically, if I break that down and if I think about it in these terms, basically I get another third as much income in this business. But the big benefit here is that my overhead cost structure doesn't really change. And when I'm talking an overhead cost structure, I'm really talking about the cost of doing business, which is admin, motor vehicles, insurance, rates and rents, all those sorts of things. They don't change when I buy another 250 cows. What might change is a bit more labour costs, because I might have been at the edge already. So yes, I need more labour. But now I'm looking at it and saying, right, I need a bit more labour. I need a bit more operating costs. So let's say we need $10 a DSE more labour, and I need $6 a DSE more operating or enterprise costs. That's $16 a DSE, provided my income, which sits at about $60 a DSE, exceeds that. Then what I'm telling you is the marginal benefit exceeds the marginal cost. Now, that hasn't covered the cost of financing at the moment, but I know that the cost of financing, that's another thing you need to take into account, of course. But I know if I do some crafty maths that I can work out that it's still worth my while, because the return on investment in that is about over 30%, and the cost of funds is about 7%. So I'm netting 23% at least out of that investment. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks, John. While I get my slides back up, just one more quick question that's come through, and any other questions we don't get to tonight, I'll make sure we address in our podcast for those listeners. If your questions don't get answered, we'll do them in our podcast episode. The question that's come through, is 50% feed utilisation an arbitrary target, or is it a true metric to aim for?
Yeah, so thanks for the question. So the challenge with feed utilisation is it's nearly impossible to calculate it, because it's nearly impossible to calculate the amount of feed that you've got across your farm. So that is an absolute challenge, and I accept that is really difficult. But I guess what it does force you to think about, so the reason I like to think in feed utilisation terms is it forces me to think about the maths. And basically farming is just maths, sort of livestock production is maths. So if I can pitch it this way, so a DSE, so the answer to the question is 50%. When I'm talking feed utilisation, I just want to quantify what I mean by that. The first thing is that is the amount of feed eaten, the proportion of feed eaten relative to the proportion of feed grown. So let's say I grow 8 tonnes per hectare of dry matter across the farm. Really what I'm saying is that I'm eating 4 tonnes of that feed across the farm. That's basically what I'm saying when I do that metric. Now, if I've got 4 tonnes of feed, and I'm just defaulting over here to the beauty about I guess talking in DSEs is that we know that one DSE consumes roughly 0.8 of a kilo of dry matter per day. So if you multiply 0.8 of a kilo of dry matter per day by 365 days of the year, it tells me that that DSE will consume 292 kilos a year, or roughly, let's call it 300 to use round numbers. So I had 8 tonnes. I want to eat 4 of it, 4,000, and I'm going to divide that 4,000 by 300, gives me a stocking rate of 13.3 DSEs per hectare. Will achieve that. So lots of things tied up in that. And how do I know that you're going to grow 8 tonnes of dry matter per hectare per year? I don't. But what you've got to do, or not what you've got to do, what I would encourage you to do is seek feed curves for all the different pasture types across your business, and then use those to actually establish what your annual feed is. So the curve that I put up before, which was the two blips, might have had 10 kilos per hectare per day at a certain point and 50 kilos per day at another point. If you average those out across the year and it comes up with, I don't know, let's say it comes up with 20 kilos equals 20 by 365 days of the year, that tells me that you're going to grow 7.3 tonnes on average across the farm. So lots to unpack there. Hopefully I've answered that appropriately, Nish.
Thank you, John. Yeah, definitely. And we can go back through your slides as well to step through some of that feed supply and how to get that from the MLA website as well.
Yep.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you, John. Unfortunately, we've ran out of time tonight, but those extra questions, as I just said, John and I are recording a podcast, so we'll make sure that we answer those in the podcast. Thank you very much, John, for giving us a crash course in production and cost of production. And I've also had some comments come through about the explanation of production making sense. So that's great to hear already. For those in the audience, if you have any additional questions or suggestions for future webinar topics, please reach out by completing the survey that's in the QR code on your screen. This feedback really helps us to guide future webinar topics to make sure that we're getting something that's relevant to you. If you're listening or watching the recording, please also complete the survey. There's no deadline for completion of this survey. So if you're watching the recording, make sure you jump on and complete that as well. Thank you all again for attending, and we look forward to you joining us for our next webinar on the 10th of January, where we'll be hearing from Sally Murfitt about human agronomy in agricultural businesses. If you missed last month's webinar, make sure you head over to the MLA or Agrista website to watch it. And as I mentioned, be sure to check out our podcast series. You can find it on all major podcast platforms. It's called the Productivity and Profitability Media Series, and we've got some really interesting guests there. So happy listening. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, John.
Thanks, Nish. Thanks, everyone.